The unforgivable request. Ricardo Montero had learned how to negotiate everything in life: contracts, mergers, silence, even affection. But standing in front of Livia again, after 2 years of separation, he realized there were things money and control could not smooth over. She sat across from him in the quiet corner of an upscale cafe, her posture calm, her expression guarded. She looked different, stronger, more distant. That unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. "I didn't ask you here to argue," Ricardo said, lowering his voice. "I just want closure." Livia lifted her eyes slowly. "Closure?" she repeated, as if tasting a word she no longer believed in. He leaned forward, fingers tightening around the porcelain cup. "One last night," he said. "That's all I'm asking. One night to end things properly." The words hung between them, heavy and wrong. Livia's face hardened. "You're serious?" "I am," he replied without hesitation. "We were married. We shared a life."
"I think I deserve that." Deserve. The word struck her like a slap. She laughed softly, without humor. "You disappeared for 2 years, Ricardo. You didn't ask if I was alive, and now you think you can ask for that?" His jaw tightened. "You left without explanations." "I left because you never listened." Ricardo exhaled sharply, impatient creeping in. "This isn't about the past. It's about ending things without bitterness." Livia stood up, her chair scraping lightly against the floor. "There's nothing left to end," she said. "You ended it a long time ago." As she turned to leave, Ricardo spoke again, his tone colder now. "Think carefully. Some doors don't open twice." She paused, her back still to him. For a brief moment, it seemed she might respond. But instead, she said quietly, "Some doors were never doors at all. Just exits." She walked away, leaving Ricardo alone with his untouched coffee and a growing unease he couldn't name.
What he didn't know, what would soon shatter everything he thought he understood, was that Livia wasn't walking away alone. The silence Livia left behind followed Ricardo long after she disappeared through the cafe doors. It pressed against him as he drove home, as he poured himself a drink he barely tasted, as memories he had carefully buried began to surface without permission. Their marriage had not begun in silence. It had started with laughter. There was a time when Livia filled spaces effortlessly, humming while cooking, leaving handwritten notes on the counter, waiting awake no matter how late he came home. Ricardo used to admire that devotion. He mistook it for something that would never run out. In the early years, he told himself he was building a future for both of them. Late meetings became routine. Business trips replaced weekends. Promises were postponed, not broken. At least, that was how he justified it. "After this quarter," he would say. "After this deal."
After things calmed down. They never did. Livia adapted at first. She learned to eat dinner alone. She stopped asking him to join her in small moments, walks, movies, quiet conversations before bed. Each unanswered message, each distracted nod, taught her a new kind of patience. Ricardo noticed the changes but misread them. Her silence felt convenient. Her independence reassured him. He assumed love matured into something quieter, less demanding. What he didn't notice were the nights she cried softly so he wouldn't hear, or the way her eyes searched his face, hoping to find the man who once looked at her like she mattered more than his phone. Arguments were rare but heavy. When they came, they circled the same truth without ever naming it. "I just want you here," Livia said once, her voice trembling. "I am here," Ricardo replied, gesturing vaguely, already thinking about his next call. That was when something inside her began to retreat.
The final months passed in a fragile calm. No fights, no affection. Just two people sharing a space without sharing a life. Ricardo mistook that calm for stability. For Livia, it was resignation. The day she packed her bags, she moved quietly, carefully. She didn't wake him. She didn't leave a note. Not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she had said everything already, and none of it had mattered. Ricardo would later tell himself she left suddenly, but the truth was simpler and far more painful. She had been leaving for a long time. And as Livia stepped into a future he never tried to imagine, Ricardo remained certain of one thing: she would come back. He had no idea that her departure marked not an ending, but the beginning of everything he was about to lose. The divorce was finalized on a gray morning that felt colder than it should have. Ricardo arrived at the law office 10 minutes early, dressed in a tailored suit, phone already pressed to his ear.
He ended the call only when the assistant cleared her throat and gestured toward the conference room. Livia was already there. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the papers in front of her. She wore a simple dress, nothing like the woman he had once known, who carefully chose colors he liked. That detail unsettled him more than he expected. "Let's make this quick," Ricardo said, pulling out a chair. Livia nodded once. She didn't look at him. The lawyer explained the terms in a measured tone: assets, signatures, finality. Ricardo listened with half his attention, already planning the rest of his day. To him, this was a formality, an interruption. When the pen was placed in his hand, he signed without hesitation. Livia took the pen next. Her hand trembled slightly, but she steadied it. She read every line carefully, as if making sure she wasn't leaving anything behind. Not money, not rights, not herself. Then she signed. That was it. No dramatic words, no tears.
Just the sound of paper sliding across the table. Ricardo stood first. "You know where to find me," he said, more out of habit than intention. Livia finally lifted her eyes. There was no anger in them, no sadness either. Just distance. "I don't think I ever really did," she replied. She gathered her bag and walked toward the door. For a second, Ricardo expected her to stop, to turn around, to say something that would confirm this was only temporary. She didn't. The door closed softly behind her. Ricardo exhaled, feeling oddly victorious. Clean break. No mess. No complications. That was how he liked things. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't yet see, was that Livia hadn't walked away in defeat. She had walked away in survival. And as Ricardo returned to his busy life, convinced she would eventually realize her mistake, Livia stepped into the unknown carrying a truth that would soon change everything. Life unfolded quickly after the divorce, as if the world had been waiting for their separation to move forward without them together. For Ricardo, success came faster than ever. The promotion he had chased for years finally arrived, his calendar filled with meetings, flights, and dinners that blurred into one another. Colleagues congratulated him. Partners admired his discipline. From the outside, everything looked exactly as it should. Yet nights were different. His apartment was silent, immaculate, untouched. He slept with the television on, not for entertainment, but to drown out the quiet. On rare evenings when he thought of Livia, he dismissed the feeling as nostalgia, nothing more than habit resisting change. She would reach out eventually, he told himself. She always had. Livia's life, meanwhile, moved in a completely different direction. She left the city within weeks, settling in a smaller town where no one knew her past. The job offer at a public school paid little, but it was honest work.
And it gave her something Ricardo never had: time. It was there, surrounded by unfamiliar streets and borrowed furniture, that her body began to change. At first, she blamed exhaustion, the nausea, the dizziness, the sudden sensitivity to smells. But when the test confirmed what her heart already feared, Livia sank onto the bathroom floor, pressing a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. Pregnant. The word echoed in her mind, heavy and irreversible. She thought of Ricardo, his impatience, his absence, his belief that everything could be scheduled for later. She imagined telling him, imagined the disbelief, the cold questions, the way responsibility would feel like an obligation rather than love. That night, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would raise the child alone. Months passed. Ricardo signed contracts. Livia attended medical appointments. He celebrated achievements in crowded rooms. She learned to listen to a heartbeat in silence.
Neither knew what the other was becoming. Ricardo believed he had escaped emotional weight. Livia understood she had stepped into it willingly. And somewhere between his ambition and her quiet courage, two futures moved forward, parallel, separate, and destined to collide in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Livia learned quickly that secrets have weight. They settle into the body, into the rhythm of daily life, changing the way a person breathes and thinks. Each morning, as she prepared for school, she stared at her reflection a little longer, searching for signs the world might notice what she was hiding. She told no one at first. The town was small, the school modest, and questions came easily there. When colleagues asked about her family, she smiled and changed the subject. When students asked why she sometimes looked tired, she joked about lesson plans and long nights of grading. Inside, fear and resolve fought constantly.
She thought of Ricardo more often than she wanted to admit, not out of longing, but caution. She imagined him finding out through someone else, imagined the anger in his voice, the sense of ownership he would feel over something he had never protected. That was when she knew she was doing the right thing. At night, alone in her small apartment, Livia spoke softly to the life growing inside her. She promised stability, presence, love that didn't disappear when things became inconvenient. She chose practical over ideal, safety over hope. Medical appointments became routine. She memorized schedules, expenses, sacrifices. Each step forward reinforced the reality that this was no longer just her life, it was theirs. When the doctor mentioned the possibility of complications, Livia's resolve hardened. She would not gamble her child's peace on a man who had never learned to stay. She filed paperwork, changed her emergency contacts, built a world where Ricardo did not exist. And yet,
In quiet moments, she grieved the version of her life that might have been, not because she wanted it back, but because she finally understood what it had cost her. By the time her pregnancy could no longer be hidden, Livia had already transformed. She wasn't just a woman protecting a secret anymore. She was a mother protecting a future. And somewhere far away, Ricardo continued his life, completely unaware that the consequences of his absence were already taking shape, slowly, silently, and irrevocably. The labor lasted longer than Livia had expected. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and quiet urgency. She squeezed the nurse's hand, her breath uneven, her thoughts drifting between fear and determination. There was no one else to call, no one pacing the hallway, just her, and the promise she had made to herself months earlier. When the first cry filled the room, relief washed over her in a wave so strong it left her trembling. Moments later, a second cry followed, higher,
Sharper, unmistakable. Twins. The doctor's words blurred together as Livia stared at the two tiny faces placed gently against her chest. Two lives, two hearts, two futures entirely dependent on her strength. Exhaustion gave way to something deeper. Purpose. The weeks that followed were unforgiving. Sleepless nights, endless feedings, bills that never seemed to stop arriving. Livia learned to function in fragments of rest, measuring time in minutes rather than hours. She named them quietly, whispering their names as if the world might overhear and demand something in return. There were moments she almost broke, when both cried at once, when the loneliness pressed too hard, when fear crept in during the darkest hours of night. But even then, she never doubted her choice. The twins grew quickly, their features becoming clearer each day. Sometimes, when she caught their expressions in the right light, she saw flashes of someone she used to know. She pushed the thought away.
Ricardo no longer belonged in this life. By the time Livia returned to work, she was no longer just a teacher. She was a mother who could carry 2 sleeping children in her arms without waking them, who could stretch a paycheck impossibly thin, who had learned that love was not grand gestures, but consistency. She had become someone new. And while Ricardo continued to chase achievements that felt increasingly hollow, Livia was building something far quieter and far more enduring, one exhausted, hopeful day at a time. Time reshaped everything. 2 years passed not as a single stretch, but as a series of small survivals. Livia's days settled into a rhythm dictated by school bells, lunchboxes, and bedtime stories read in soft whispers. The twins learned to walk, then to speak, filling the apartment with sounds that replaced the loneliness she once feared. She learned their habits, their silences.
The way one always reached for her hand before sleeping, while the other preferred to fall asleep listening to her voice. In those quiet routines, Livia found a peace she had never known before. Ricardo existed only as a shadow in her memory. She avoided places where the past might find her. She chose stability over curiosity, never wondering what he might be doing or who he might be with. The life she built did not include room for disappointment. Across the city, Ricardo felt the weight of time differently. His success continued, but satisfaction did not. Celebrations felt repetitive. Relationships were brief and shallow. He told himself he preferred it that way, that independence was freedom. But sometimes, late at night, an unfamiliar emptiness crept in. He wondered, briefly, what Livia might be doing, if she was happy, if she missed him. The thought irritated him more than it comforted him. 2 years of silence passed, without messages, without explanations, without closure.
To Ricardo, it felt unfinished. To Livia, it felt complete. Neither of them knew that silence was about to be broken. A single event, unplanned and unavoidable, would soon pull their carefully separated worlds into the same space, forcing truths long buried to surface. And when that moment came, silence would no longer protect anyone. Ricardo agreed to sponsor the school fundraiser without much thought. His assistant had framed it as a minor obligation, good publicity, minimal effort. He barely glanced at the name of the institution before signing off. The gymnasium buzzed with noise and movement when he arrived. Children ran between rows of chairs. Parents chatted in small groups. Colorful decorations covered the walls, imperfect and handmade. It felt foreign to him. As he scanned the room, his attention drifted, until it stopped completely. Livia stood near the stage, adjusting a microphone, her hair pulled back, her posture composed. For a moment,
Ricardo thought he was mistaken. Then she turned and their eyes met. The world narrowed. She froze only briefly before regaining her composure. He watched as she spoke to a child, crouching to their level, her voice gentle. The ease with which she moved unsettled him more than her presence itself. When they finally stood face to face, neither smiled. "I didn't know you worked here," Ricardo said, breaking the silence. "I didn't know you were sponsoring," Livia replied evenly. An awkward pause followed, filled with things neither was willing to say. "You look well," he added, unsure why the words felt inadequate. "So do you." The conversation remained careful, distant, too polite for people who had once shared a life. Ricardo searched her face for something familiar, regret, Perhaps. He found none. As the event continued, he noticed how students gravitated toward her, how naturally she commanded their trust. It stirred something uncomfortable inside him, something he didn't fully recognize. Then, from the corner of the room, he saw two small figures watching her intently. They stood close together, whispering, eyes fixed on Livia as if the rest of the room didn't exist. A strange unease settled in his chest. Before he could question it, Livia glanced toward the children. Her expression softened instantly. That was when Ricardo understood, without knowing why, that this reunion was not accidental. Something had changed. And whatever it was, it would not allow them to part again so easily. Ricardo waited until the event began to wind down before approaching Livia again. The crowd had thinned, the noise softened, and the children were being gathered by parents. Whatever had been pressing on his chest since their reunion refused to fade. "You didn't think it was worth telling me?" he asked abruptly. Livia turned toward him, confusion flickering across her face. "Telling you what?" "That you vanished," he said.
Lowering his voice, "That you rebuilt your life without a word. You disappeared like I meant nothing." Her expression tightened. "I didn't disappear. I left." "There's a difference," Ricardo snapped. "You walked away and cut me out completely. That feels deliberate." Livia crossed her arms, grounding herself. "You signed the papers without a second thought. That doesn't mean you had the right to erase me." The words hung heavy between them. Ricardo's frustration spilled over, fueled by something he didn't want to name. "You've always known how to control the narrative," he continued, "playing the victim, letting people assume things." Livia stared at him, stunned. "That's what you think this is?" "I think you wanted me to feel guilty," he said, "and it worked." For a moment she considered explaining everything, ending the tension with a single truth. But she saw it in his eyes, judgment already formed, conclusions drawn without listening. "I don't owe you an explanation," she said quietly. Ricardo scoffed. "Convenient." That was when a familiar voice interrupted the confrontation. "Mom?" Livia turned instantly. Two small figures stood just a few steps away, watching them with wide, curious eyes. Ricardo followed her gaze, irritation still sharp, until it stalled completely. The children looked at him. Not past him. At him. And for the first time since the accusation left his mouth, Ricardo felt something falter, something deep and unsettling, just before the world he knew began to crack. "Mommy!" The word echoed through the nearly empty gymnasium, cutting through Ricardo's thoughts like glass. Livia moved instantly, kneeling to the children's level, her entire presence softening. "I'm here," she said gently, brushing a curl away from one child's face. "I told you to wait by the door, remember?" They nodded in unison, eyes still fixed on Ricardo with open curiosity. Something about the symmetry unsettled him, the way they stood close together, the shared expressions, the familiar tilt of their heads. His chest tightened as recognition crept in uninvited. "How old are they?" he asked, his voice lower than before. Livia hesitated for just a second too long. "Almost 2, she replied. The number struck him with quiet force. 2 years. The timeline assembled itself in his mind, piece by piece. His throat went dry. "They're yours?" he asked, though the question sounded hollow even to him. Livia rose slowly, placing herself between Ricardo and the children, instinctive and protective. "They're mine," she corrected. One of the twins tugged at her hand. "Who's he?" the child whispered, not quietly enough. Livia swallowed. "Just someone I used to know." Ricardo felt the floor tilt beneath him. He searched her face for denial, for a reassurance that his mind was reaching too far. He found neither. The resemblance was undeniable now. The eyes, the structure of their faces, the way one frowned in concentration, exactly as he did. Reality closed in, heavy and unavoidable. "What didn't you tell me, Livia?"
he asked, his voice barely steady. She looked at him, eyes calm but resolute. "Not here," she said. And as the children wrapped their arms around her legs, Ricardo understood something had been taken from him, something he had never even known existed. They stood outside the school, the evening air cool and heavy with unspoken tension. The twins waited a few steps away, distracted by a set of chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Livia kept her eyes on them, as if anchoring herself to their presence. "You should leave," she said quietly. Ricardo didn't move. "Not until you tell me the truth." She exhaled slowly, then turned to face him. There was no fear in her expression, only exhaustion. "They're yours," she said at last. The words landed without drama, without anger. That made them more devastating. Ricardo stared at her,
Disbelief hardening into something sharper. "You had no right," he said, his voice rising. "You decided my life without asking." "You decided long before I ever did," Livia replied. "You stole 2 years from me," he snapped. "I protected them from waiting for someone who never showed up." The anger drained from him, replaced by confusion and pain. "I would have been there." Livia shook her head. "You weren't there when it was just me." Silence stretched between them. "They ask about their father," she continued, her voice steady despite the weight of the words. "I tell them he doesn't live with us, that he's not part of our days, that he's not someone they should expect." Ricardo's chest tightened. "So I'm a story now?" "You are an absence," she said softly. He turned away, dragging a hand through his hair. Every memory replayed itself differently now. Every late night, every ignored call, every moment he had chosen work over presence. "I didn't know," he said again.
Weaker this time. "I know," Livia replied, "and that's the tragedy." For the first time since the divorce, Ricardo felt something break. Not loudly, but completely. The success he had built suddenly felt meaningless compared to the lives standing just a few feet away. And as the twins laughed quietly behind them, unaware of the truth unfolding, Ricardo understood that knowing came far too late to undo what had already been lost. That night, Ricardo couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his apartment, staring at the ceiling, the city lights casting restless shadows across the room. For the first time in years, silence no longer felt neutral. It felt accusatory. Every memory replayed itself with cruel clarity. The unanswered calls, the postponed dinners, the moments he had dismissed as unimportant. He saw them now not as isolated choices, but as a pattern, one that had shaped lives without his awareness. He had believed success excused absence. It didn't.
Ricardo poured himself a drink and let it sit untouched. His reflection in the glass window looked unfamiliar, older, smaller somehow. The man who prided himself on control realized how little he had actually governed. 2 children existed in the world carrying his features, his blood, his legacy, and he had been nowhere. The realization hollowed him out. For the first time, he questioned everything he had chased: promotions, recognition, the constant reassurance of being needed by everyone except the people who mattered most. He thought of Livia, her calm strength, her refusal to beg, the way she stood between him and the twins without hesitation. He had mistaken her silence for weakness. It had been resolve. By morning, his pride lay in pieces, not shattered by failure, but by truth. Ricardo understood something then. Regret was not loud. It didn't scream. It settled quietly, seeping into every corner of the life he had built.
Turning achievements into reminders of what they had cost. And for the first time, he didn't ask what he wanted. He asked what he had to do. Because knowing he was a father was no longer enough. If he wanted to be more than a name never spoken, he would have to earn a place in lives that had already learned how to survive without him.
Ricardo returned to the school 2 days later. This time he came without an assistant, without a suit, without a reason that could be written off as obligation. He waited outside until Livia noticed him, giving her the choice he had so often denied her in the past. "I'm not here to argue," he said before she could speak, "and I'm not here to demand anything." Livia studied him carefully, searching for impatience, for arrogance. She found neither. "I want to be part of their lives," Ricardo continued, "but only if that doesn't disrupt what you've built." She didn't answer right away. "Being a father isn't about biology," Livia said finally.
It's about showing up when no one is watching, about consistency, about staying. "I know," he replied, "and I know I haven't earned that." The twins peeked out from behind her legs, curiosity overcoming caution. Ricardo lowered himself to their height, careful not to invade their space. "Hi," he said softly. They stared back, silent but attentive. Livia watched closely. This was not reconciliation. This was evaluation. "You don't get promises," she told him. "You get time, and even that is conditional." Ricardo nodded. "That's fair." As he walked away later that day, he felt no triumph, only responsibility. For the first time in his life, progress would not be measured in speed or results, but in patience. Behind him, Livia held her children close, uncertain but open to possibility. The door had not been reopened, but it had not been locked either. Ricardo stood across the street from the school,
watching through the iron gate as Livia helped the twins into their small jackets. The afternoon light softened everything, the building, the pavement, even the distance between them. He didn't cross the street. Not because he didn't want to, but because he was learning that presence sometimes meant restraint. The twins laughed as they tugged at each other's sleeves, their voices bright and unburdened. Livia corrected them gently, her movements instinctive, practiced. This was her world, one she had built without asking permission, without waiting for anyone to return. Ricardo felt the familiar pull to step in, to claim space, to be seen. Instead, he stayed where he was. He understood now that love was not proven through grand gestures or sudden declarations. It was built quietly, through repetition, patience, and humility, things he had once dismissed as secondary. Livia glanced up and noticed him. Their eyes met briefly. There was no anger there, no forgiveness either.
Just acknowledgement. That was enough. She turned back to the children, taking their hands as they walked away. Ricardo watched until they disappeared around the corner, the sound of their laughter fading into the city's hum. He exhaled slowly. Some stories did not end with reconciliation. Some truths did not offer relief, only clarity. And clarity, he had learned, could be heavier than ignorance. Ricardo walked in the opposite direction, not toward loss, but toward responsibility. He didn't know if he would ever be called father by name. He didn't know if Livia would ever trust him fully. What he knew was this: love ignored does not vanish. It waits. And when it returns, it does not ask what you feel. It asks who you have become. The future remained uncertain, but the truth was finally complete.